The storm had come without warning. A once calm sea transformed into a seething monster, waves rising like liquid walls to swallow the sky. The Azure Star, a sturdy vessel, was no match. Sailors shouted orders over the wind's deafening roar, ropes snapping like whips as the mast splintered and fell. Lightning illuminated the chaos, a fleeting snapshot of terror etched into Lila Kane's mind. She clung to the railing as the ship tilted violently. Water rushed the deck, dragging crew and cargo alike into the abyss. Someone screamed her name, but the storm drowned their voice. Then came the impact. Wood shattered, cold water engulfed her, and everything went black. Lila gasped awake, her lungs burning. She was on her stomach, face pressed into wet sand, the tang of salt heavy on her tongue. The echo of crashing waves filled her ears as she pushed herself up, her limbs trembling. Her head throbbed, memories of the wreck filtering through her mind like fragments of a shattered mirror. The beach stretched wide before her, barren and desolate. Beyond the shoreline, jagged cliffs loomed, their faces scarred by centuries of erosion. The wreck of the Azure Star was nowhere in sight. The only traces of the storm were the debris scattered along the sand, fragments of wood, torn sails, and the occasional piece of cargo half buried in the surf. Lila rose unsteadily, every muscle in her body aching. She scanned the horizon, her heart sinking as she realized how utterly alone she was. The ocean stretched endlessly to one side, the cliffs offered no comfort on the other. A cold wind whispered through the emptiness, raising goosebumps on her skin. Then she heard it. It was faint at first, a low hum that seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of the waves. It wasn't the wind, nor the crash of the tide. It was something else, something unnatural. The sound made her stomach tighten, a primal unease prickling at the edges of her awareness. She turned toward the cliffs. The hum seemed to emanate from somewhere beyond them, a vibration that reverberated in her chest. She took a step forward, then hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to stay put, to avoid whatever was making that sound. But fear and curiosity waged war within her, and curiosity won. Lila picked her way along the beach, avoiding sharp rocks and slippery seaweed. Her boots squelched with every step, soaked through from the tide. The hum grew louder, more insistent, as she neared the base of the cliffs. A path wound upward, narrow and treacherous, carved into the rock by centuries of wind and water. She hesitated at its base, staring up at the steep ascent. The hum seemed to thrum in her bones now, pulling her forward like a siren's call. Gritting her teeth, she began to climb. The wind intensified as she ascended, whipping her hair into her face and threatening to unbalance her. The edges of the path crumbled under her boots, sending small cascades of stones tumbling into the surf below. She gripped the rock wall for stability, her fingers aching from the effort. When she finally reached the top, the wind hit her like a physical blow. She staggered, shielding her eyes from the grit it carried. The source of the sound lay ahead, a ruin perched precariously on the cliff's edge. It was unlike anything she'd ever seen, its architecture alien and foreboding. The structure was circular, its walls built from black stone that seemed to absorb the light. Strange carvings covered its surface, intricate patterns that pulsed faintly with a dim, bluish glow. The hum emanated from within, rising and falling like a heartbeat. Lila approached cautiously, her every step a battle between terror and fascination. The carvings seemed to shift as she drew closer, the glowing lines rearranging themselves into patterns that defied logic. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the stone, and then froze. A voice, soft and barely audible, whispered in her ear. "Come!" She spun around, expecting to find someone behind her, but the cliff was empty. The wind howled, but there was no sign of another soul. Her heart raced as she turned back to the ruin. The hum had changed, its rhythm quickening, growing more insistent. The carvings pulsed brighter, casting an eerie light over the cliff's edge. Lila's hand trembled as she touched the stone. It was cold, unnaturally so, and sent a shiver up her arm. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, the ground beneath her feet unsteady. She pulled her hand back, gasping, and stumbled away. The hum stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on her like a physical weight. The air grew still, the wind ceasing entirely. For a heartbeat, she thought she'd imagined it all. Then the carvings flared with blinding light, and the ruin groaned as if alive. A crack split the ground beneath her feet. Lila barely had time to leap back before the cliff face gave way, stone tumbling into the sea below. The ruin shook, its glowing lines growing erratic. From within, a deep, guttural sound emerged, a noise that resonated with ancient power. She scrambled back, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Whatever this place was, it wasn't safe. She needed to leave, now. But as she turned to flee, the voice returned, louder this time. Stay. Lila froze, her blood turning to ice. The hum resumed, more menacing than before, as the light from the carvings bathed her in an otherworldly glow. The ruin seemed to shift, its alien architecture twisting into shapes her mind couldn't comprehend. The voice whispered again, its tone both commanding and mournful. The shore remembers. Lila didn't understand, but one thing was clear, she was no longer alone. The cliff was crumbling beneath her feet, but the voice held her frozen in place. The hum pulsed louder now, reverberating through her chest like the beat of some colossal, unseen heart. The glowing lines on the ruin shifted again, their patterns rearranging into something that almost resembled language. Alien symbols twisted and turned, beckoning her forward. Lila clenched her fists, forcing herself to break free of the trance. She stumbled back, her boots scraping against the loose gravel at the cliff's edge. She didn't know what the ruin was, nor what the voice wanted, but every instinct screamed at her to get away. She turned and ran. The path down the cliff was more treacherous than she remembered. Rocks gave way under her feet, sending her sliding toward the jagged drop-off. She caught herself on an outcropping, her heart pounding as she glanced back up at the ruin. Its glow was dimming now, the hum retreating to a faint whisper. But the voice lingered, low and insistent, burrowing into her thoughts like a splinter. You can't leave! The words weren't spoken aloud, they were inside her head, clear and impossible to ignore. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to focus on her descent. Her fingers ached as she gripped the jagged rock face, her mind racing. How could she escape something that seemed to be everywhere at once? When her boots finally hit the sand, she doubled over, gasping for air. The wind was picking up again, the sea churning violently against the shore. She glanced back at the cliff, half expecting the ruin to collapse into the ocean. But it remained perched there, silent and foreboding. She didn't stay long. The hum had gone quiet, but she knew better than to trust the silence. She picked her way along the beach, scanning the wreckage for anything that could be useful. Most of the debris was unrecognizable, splintered planks, twisted metal, and shredded cloth. But then she spotted something familiar, a small, leather-bound journal half buried in the sand. Lila hesitated before picking it up. The leather was cracked, the edges of the pages warped from seawater. She flipped it open, her fingers trembling as she scanned the contents. Most of the writing was illegible, the ink smeared into dark blotches. But a few words stood out, etched deep into the page as if carved with desperation. The shore remembers. The whispers are a warning. Do not enter the ruin. Her stomach churned. Whoever had written this had known about the ruin, about the voice. But why were they warning her? And what had happened to them? She flipped to the next page, but it was blank. The journal offered no answers, only more questions. A shadow passed over the sand, and Lila froze. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat. The cliffs loomed tall and jagged against the gray sky, but something moved among them, something large. At first, it was only a flicker of motion, a dark shape against the rock. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw it clearly. The figure was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements unnaturally fluid. Its skin shimmered faintly, like the surface of a disturbed pool, and its eyes, two pinpricks of glowing light, locked onto hers with unnerving precision. Lila's body moved before her mind could process the danger. She bolted down the beach, clutching the journal tightly against her chest. The creature followed, its footsteps unnervingly silent against the sand. She didn't dare look back, The memory of those glowing eyes was enough to propel her forward. The beach stretched endlessly before her, its emptiness offering no cover, no refuge. The jagged wrecks of ships jutted from the sand like the ribs of long-dead leviathans, but they were too far away to offer shelter. Her lungs burned as she pushed herself to run faster, her heart hammering in her chest. The hum returned, louder and more menacing than before. The voice whispered again, its tone sharper now, almost angry. "You cannot run!" Lila stumbled, her foot catching on a piece of debris. She hit the sand hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Gasping, she rolled onto her back, her eyes wide with terror as the creature closed the distance between them. It didn't run. It didn't need to. Its long, spindly legs carried it forward in smooth, unhurried strides, its glowing eyes fixed on her with unsettling focus. Lila scrambled backward, her hands clawing at the sand, but she knew she couldn't outrun it. The hum grew deafening as the creature loomed over her. Its shadow stretched across the beach, swallowing her in darkness. She raised the journal as if it could somehow shield her, her heart racing as the creature leaned down. But it didn't attack. It stopped just short of her, its head tilting as if studying her. The hum softened, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the voice returned, soft and mournful. "You were warned!" The creature's hand extended, its fingers long and clawed. Lila flinched, but instead of grabbing her, it pointed to the cliffs. The hum shifted, the vibrations resonating through the ground beneath her. She turned her head, her eyes following the creature's gesture. The ruin was glowing again. The light from the ruin was different this time. It was brighter, more frantic, its pulsing rhythm erratic. The carvings along its surface seemed to shift and twist, forming shapes she couldn't comprehend. The journal's words echoed in her mind. "Do not enter the ruin!" But she didn't have a choice. The creature straightened, its gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before it turned and disappeared into the cliffs. Lila sat there, trembling, as the hum faded into silence. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She looked down at the journal, her fingers tightening around it. The warning was clear, but so was the message. The ruin held the answers. Whatever this place was, whatever the voice was, it was tied to that structure. And if she wanted to survive, she had to face it. She rose to her feet, her body shaking with exhaustion and fear. The wind howled around her as she turned toward the cliffs. The path to the ruin loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but there was no turning back now. The shore wasn't just a graveyard. It was alive, and it had plans for her. The climb back up the cliffs was more grueling than before. The path was slick with moisture from the ever-present mist, and every step felt like a gamble against gravity. Lila's hands bled from gripping jagged rocks, her breath shallow and rapid. The ruin's glow intensified the higher she climbed, illuminating the path in a way that felt both helpful and menacing. The voice was silent now, but the hum had returned, resonating through the cliff face and into her bones. It was slower, steadier, like the heartbeat of the ruin itself. Lila paused halfway up the climb, pressing her forehead against the cool stone as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. "Why am I doing this?" she muttered, her voice barely audible over the wind. But deep down, she knew the answer. The creature's warning, the journal's cryptic words, and the pull of the ruin all pointed to the same truth. There was no escaping this place without understanding it first. She forced herself onward. When she finally reached the top, the ruin greeted her with an ominous hum, its patterns shifting across the black stone walls like liquid fire. The carvings glowed brighter now, pulsating in a rhythm that seemed to match her racing heartbeat. The circular structure loomed larger than she remembered, its architecture defying logic with angles that bent impossibly, and shapes that seemed to shift when she looked away. Lila approached cautiously, her fingers brushing against the journal tucked in her pocket. The closer she got, the more her body rebelled, her muscles tightened, her breath hitched, and her chest burned with a deep, primal fear. But the pull of the ruin was stronger than her instincts, compelling her forward. As she stepped inside, the hum crescendoed into a deafening roar. The interior of the ruin was cavernous and impossibly vast, far larger than the structure should have allowed. Veins of glowing light crisscrossed the walls and floor, pulsating in the same hypnotic rhythm as the carvings. At the center of the chamber, a massive stone platform rose from the ground, its surface covered in intricate symbols that glowed with a blinding intensity. Hovering above the platform was an orb of light, its surface swirling with shifting colors. Tendrils of energy extended from the orb, snaking through the air and connecting to the glowing veins in the walls. Lila's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the orb. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, and undeniably alive. The hum quieted as she stepped closer, replaced by the low, guttural whisper of the voice. "You have come!" Lila froze, her heart pounding. The voice was clearer now, no longer just a presence in her mind. It resonated through the chamber, filling the space with a weight that pressed down on her shoulders. She wanted to respond, to demand answers, but her throat was dry, and her voice failed her. The orb pulsed, and the tendrils lashed out suddenly, striking the ground around her. Lila stumbled back, her hands raised defensively. The voice returned, louder this time. "You were warned! You did not listen!" The tendrils began to move with purpose, snaking toward her like living things. Lila dodged the first strike, her movements clumsy but desperate. The second tendril grazed her arm, sending a shock of pain through her body. She cried out, clutching her arm as the mark she hadn't realized was there began to glow. Her sleeve burned away, revealing the same glowing pattern she'd seen on the ruin's walls. They spread across her skin like fire, crawling up her arm and onto her chest. The pain was unbearable, but Lila forced herself to stay standing. She couldn't let the ruin take her, not without a fight. "You want something from me," she said through gritted teeth, her voice shaking but defiant. "What is it?" The voice didn't answer immediately. The orb pulsed again, brighter this time, and the carvings on the wall shifted once more. The symbols rearranged themselves into shapes she could almost understand, their meaning just out of reach. The tendrils paused, hovering in the air as if waiting. Then the voice spoke again, its tone quieter but no less commanding. "The shore remembers. You must remember too." A sudden flood of images filled her mind. They weren't hers, memories of people she didn't know, lives she'd never lived. A sailor clutching the side of a sinking ship. A woman standing on the cliffs, her face turned toward the storm. A group of figures in hooded cloaks, gathered around the ruin as it pulsed with light. The images came faster and faster, blending together in a chaotic blur. Lila fell to her knees, clutching her head as the memories overwhelmed her. She felt their fear, their despair, their hope. They had all come to the ruin seeking something: salvation, knowledge, escape. But none of them had found it. The voice returned, soft but insistent. "Do you see now? You are not the first. You will not be the last." Lila forced herself to look up at the orb. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you bring me here?" The orb pulsed, its light dimming. The tendrils withdrew, coiling back into the air like serpents. The voice spoke one final time, its words echoing in her mind long after they were spoken. "To end what began." The chamber began to tremble, the glowing veins in the walls flickering like dying embers. The orb's light grew erratic, its surface cracking and splitting as if under immense pressure. Lila scrambled to her feet, her instincts screaming at her to run, but the ruin wasn't letting her go. The platform beneath the orb cracked open, revealing a second chamber below. From within, a faint light glimmered, steady and calm. The voice whispered again, barely audible now. "Choose." Lila hesitated, staring down into the darkness below. Whatever was down there, it held the answers she sought, or her doom. She glanced back at the orb, its light growing weaker by the second. She took a deep breath, tightened her grip on the journal, and stepped into the void. The descent was not a fall, but a pull, a disorienting slide into the void, as though the ruin itself had decided her fate. Lila's body floated weightlessly, the glow of the orb above her fading into darkness. The air grew heavy, dense with the same low hum that had haunted her since the beach. Then, without warning, she landed. The impact wasn't hard, but it stole her breath. She lay on smooth, cold stone, staring up into a void of shifting light. The chamber was larger than anything she had seen, its walls alive with pulsating veins of blue and green light. Symbols carved into the floor glowed faintly beneath her, forming concentric patterns that spiraled toward the center of the room. At the center, suspended above the ground, was another orb, this one smaller, dimmer, and fractured. Its surface was riddled with cracks, faint tendrils of light spilling out like smoke. Beneath it, a figure knelt, shrouded in shadow. The figure's head turned slowly toward Lila, revealing glowing eyes like twin stars. Another, the figure rasped, its voice brittle and ancient. Come to finish what they could not. Lila rose cautiously, her fingers brushing the journal tucked in her belt. Who are you? She demanded, her voice trembling. What is this place? The figure stood, its movements slow and deliberate. It was tall, impossibly so, its limbs long and angular like the creatures she had encountered on the beach. But there was something different about this one, something less monstrous, more human. I was the first, it said, its voice echoing through the chamber. The first to answer the call. The first to be claimed. It gestured to the fractured orb above them, its light flickering weakly. The island chose me to protect its heart, to guard its memory. And now it chooses you. Lila took a step back, her heart racing. I didn't choose anything, she snapped. I just want to leave. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. There is no leaving, it said. Not without balance. Not without sacrifice. The orb pulsed, and the carvings beneath Lila's feet flared to life. She stumbled as the ground trembled, the veins in the walls flickering erratically. The figure gestured toward the journal in her hand. You carry the warnings of those who came before, it said. You know what must be done. Lila looked down at the journal, her hands trembling. The words etched into its pages came rushing back to her. Do not enter the ruin. The shore remembers. There's no escape. What do you mean? She demanded. What must be done? The figure stepped closer, and Lila resisted the urge to retreat. Its glowing eyes bore into hers, and when it spoke, its voice was softer, almost sorrowful. The heart is broken, it said, gesturing to the fractured orb. Its power spills into the world unchecked. It consumes everything. The storms. The whispers. The creatures. They are echoes of its hunger. It pointed to the glowing mark on Lila's arm, which pulsed faintly in time with the orb. You are bound to it now. As I was. Only one can restore the balance. The chamber trembled again, the orb's light flickering dangerously. Lila's mind raced. The journal's warnings made sense now. They hadn't been warnings of danger, but of responsibility. The ruin wasn't a prison. It was a wound, and the island was dying from it. The figure stepped back, its form dissolving into shadows. You have a choice, it said, its voice echoing as it faded. Sacrifice yourself, and the heart will heal. The balance will be restored. Or walk away, and the island will devour you, and all who come after. The weight of the words settled on Lila like a crushing tide. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she turned her gaze to the orb. It pulsed weakly, its cracks deepening. The tendrils of light reached for her, their touch warm and oddly comforting. She clenched her fists, her thoughts spinning. Could she do it? Could she give herself to this place, to save something she barely understood? Or was survival the only choice that made sense? As she hesitated, the carvings on the floor flared brighter, the patterns shifting into something new. Images flashed in her mind, visions of the island as it had been before the ruin fractured. Lush forests teeming with life. Clear skies unmarred by storms. A shore that welcomed travelers instead of claiming them. And then, a glimpse of the future. The island overrun with chaos, the storms growing stronger, the creatures multiplying. A world consumed by the echoes of the heart's hunger. The hum grew louder, filling the chamber with its relentless rhythm. The orb pulsed one final time, its light fading to a faint glow. The choice was hers to make. Lila stepped forward, her heart hammering. She placed her hand on the orb, its surface warm beneath her touch. The light surged, wrapping around her like a cocoon. For a moment she felt everything: the island's pain, its memories, its desperate need for balance. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But I can't." She pulled her hand away. The orb cracked further, its light dimming until it was barely more than a flicker. The chamber began to collapse, the veins in the walls shattering like glass. Lila turned and ran, her boots slipping on the trembling ground. The island roared around her, a sound of anger and despair that chased her as she climbed back to the surface. When she emerged onto the cliffs, the ruin was gone. The storm clouds churned above, darker and more violent than before. The shore stretched before her, empty and lifeless. She didn't stop. She ran toward the horizon, the voice echoing in her mind one final time. "You cannot escape the shore,"